What happened to education and why society went mad? Part 2. 1980s. Henry Giroux brings Freirean pedagogy to the U.S. In the 1980s, Henry Giroux, a prominent educational theorist, played a pivotal role in adapting Paulo Freire's work for an American context. He expanded on Freire's ideas, particularly focusing on the role of education in the reproduction of social power and oppression. However, Giroux introduced elements of postmodern thought, which would later become a cornerstone of modern social justice education. Postmodernism. Postmodernism is skeptical of grand narratives and traditional systems of knowledge, emphasizing deconstruction and a focus on individual perspectives and power dynamics. This shift away from universal truth or objectivity meant that education was no longer about transmitting knowledge or creating well-rounded citizens, but about recognizing and critiquing power relations in society. Giroux's fusion of Freirean pedagogy with postmodernism helped to reframe education as a tool for social transformation. This set the stage for activist-driven education, where the focus shifted from academic rigor and competency toward the goal of raising awareness about social injustices and creating political activists out of students. It helped establish the framework for an education system that viewed knowledge as inherently tied to power, creating a foundation for the development of CRT-based education in the 1990s. 1990s, Gloria Ladson-Billings and the emergence of CRT in education. In the 1990s, Gloria Ladson-Billings, a key figure in the development of critical race theory, adapted the principles of Freire's pedagogy and postmodern thought to focus specifically on race and racism within education. This period marked a shift from class-based struggles to race-based struggles, reflecting the broader social movements of the time, including identity politics and multiculturalism. Ladson-Billings, in her work, argued that the educational system in the U.S. was not just a tool for social mobility, but a reproduction of racial inequality. She believed that the curriculum and educational structures themselves were inherently biased toward white, Eurocentric perspectives, and that an education system grounded in CRT would focus on identifying and deconstructing these biases. She also emphasized the importance of culturally relevant pedagogy, meaning that the educational content should be relevant to students' cultural backgrounds, particularly those from historically marginalized communities. This approach was part of the broader move toward education as a site for social justice activism, focusing on the lived experiences of students rather than neutral, objective knowledge. This transformation marked an important moment in the evolution of social justice education in the U.S., where education began to be framed as a means to address systemic racial inequality and create activists rather than skilled, knowledgeable citizens. 2000s. Joe Kincheloe and Zeus Leonardo expand Freirean pedagogy into activist training. By the 2000s, Joe Kincheloe and Zeus Leonardo further expanded Freirean pedagogy by moving beyond simply critiquing social structures to actively rejecting objectivity in education. They emphasized that education could never be neutral because all knowledge is inherently political and ideological. Kincheloe and Leonardo's work aligned closely with post-structuralist thought, which argued that objective knowledge was a myth. They contended that education should be explicitly activist, aiming not only to challenge systems of oppression, but to reshape society entirely. Their educational framework emphasized ideological commitment and activism over neutrality or objectivity. The educational system became increasingly focused on social justice education, where students were encouraged to see themselves as agents of social change. This meant that teachers and students were no longer just working to master content, but were expected to engage in consciousness-raising activities rooted in political activism. Education in this sense was no longer about objective knowledge, but about transforming society through social action. 2010s through the 2020s, Ibram X, Kendi, and mainstreaming anti-racist frameworks. By the 2010s and 2020s, the ideas of Freire, postmodernism, and CRT had evolved into more mainstream educational policies, especially in the form of anti-racist education. Ibram X, Kendi became a central figure in this shift, especially with his book How to Be an Anti-Racist, 2019, which argued that racial equity required not just an understanding of racism, but an active commitment to anti-racism. Kendi's framework. Kendi proposed that all policies and educational practices should be evaluated based on their impact on racial equity. Rather than focusing on addressing inequality through merit-based or class-based solutions, he called for a focus on racial justice, framing racism as an issue not only of personal prejudice but also of systemic power dynamics. In education, this meant that curriculum and pedagogy were evaluated through an anti-racist lens, and schools were encouraged to actively fight against systemic racism. This included efforts to decolonize curricula, diversify teaching materials, and focus on racial equity in every aspect of school life. Anti-racist frameworks became a core part of public policy, especially in K-12 schools and higher education. Critical race theory moved from the academic realm into mainstream policy discussions. Diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) initiatives proliferated across educational institutions, including in college admissions, teaching practices, and curriculum development. This shift reinforced the idea that education should not be neutral, but instead an active tool for challenging systemic racism. Here there was a cleaver trick where they were not teaching CRT, but instead a new American modified Freirean education method, which allowed them to assert that they were not, in fact, teaching CRT. By telling a truth, but telling it slant and without all of the facts, they were able to avoid, for a time, public backlash, until it was relieved that the institutions, teachers, etc., had themselves brought CRT books into a lot of the schools. This led to CRT no longer being a conspiracy, but leaving the public, as it is mostly still, uncertain of what had happened to get to the point where ideas like that could enter our schools. Where we are now. Education as a political battlefield. Today, education is seen by many as a politically charged field, where the teaching of core subjects like math, science, and history is often intertwined with ideological and political agendas. Many argue that the educational system is now more about social activism than about academic competence, with education being used as a tool to address racial and gender issues, advocate for social justice, and challenge capitalist and colonial structures. Rejection of objectivity. The legacy of postmodernism and the Freirean emphasis on dialogue over content has led to a widespread rejection of objectivity in education, where teachers and students are encouraged to view every subject through a lens of power dynamics and social justice. Political polarization. This shift has led to a politicized educational environment where issues like CRT, gender identity, and race dominate debates in schools. Teachers are often expected to advocate for particular political stances, and schools are tasked with not only educating, but also shaping students' political consciousness. Criticism and backlash. There is significant backlash against these approaches, with critics arguing that education should be focused on skills and knowledge acquisition, not political ideology. The debate continues, and we see ongoing conflicts over curriculum changes, standardized testing, and the role of education in shaping societal values. The journey from Freire's educational philosophy to contemporary anti-racist and CRT-influenced educational practices reflects the growing fusion of education and political ideology, moving from a focus on academic excellence to an emphasis on social activism, identity politics, and transforming society through education. This has created a polarized and ideologically driven educational landscape with ongoing debates about its long-term impact on students and society. Furthermore, the form of education is really and truly a Marxist doctrine. There were later on more elements, as I will call them, of the oppressed that were introduced, which I will go into in a future episode. These being feminist theory, queer theory, trans theory, post-colonial theory, and the theory of intersectionality, among a large list of critical theories. But the takeaway here is that modern American educational theory is directly descended from Freirean education, which is in and of itself a Marxification of education. This Marxification was done with the structure of education itself rather than teach Marxist thought directly from the horse's mouth. Implementation of education like this allowed several things. First, to teach people Marxism without them knowing they were learning Marxist thought patterns. Where other countries had to enforce these thought patterns, they would be self-sustaining and without the guilt on the part of the person who had internalized the idea when called out. Second, it allowed for a change in focus of Marxism from class to a larger numbers of concerns, thus seeding many divisions where old-school Marxism only created one. Lastly, it allowed for many areas of academic study, I say study with the most amount of sarcasm, to become legitimized, allowing them to write still yet more theories. These new theories going after still yet more areas of traditional American culture, and that is what they were going after, the destruction of American culture, because Marx believed that society could not reach the utopian society without first ridding itself of the old bourgeoisie culture. For now, I am Red of Red Takedown. You can find me on many platforms, and this has been the Plunge Report, explaining what happened to education and why society went mad. Thanks for watching.